I was 16 when my father grounded me in front of 30 relatives, stripped my dignity down to nothing and called it discipline. I thought that night would define my life forever. But then his lawyer walked through the door, holding a folder that didn't belong to me. It belonged to the truth. And everything my father thought he controlled came crashing down in a single breath. I still remember the smell of that house before I remember the words. Cardamom and fried onions clinging to the curtains, the low hum of overlapping conversations, laughter bouncing off walls that had seemed decades of family gatherings. It was my grandmother's anniversary dinner, the kind of event no one ever skipped, no matter how fractured things were beneath the surface. 30 relatives, give or take, packed into a living room that suddenly felt too small for my lungs. I stood near the hallway, fingers curled into my sleeves, already feeling like I didn't belong there. My father had been watching me all evening. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before the rain hits, heavy, unavoidable, charged with something ugly. My dad had a way of turning silence into a weapon. He wouldn't yell right away, he'd wait. He'd let the room fill up with comfort, with food and chatter until everyone felt safe. Then he'd strike. I didn't know what I'd done wrong that time. Maybe I'd spoken back the night before. Maybe I'd forgotten to text him when I stayed late at school. With him, the offense never mattered. Control did. He cleared his throat, sharp and deliberate, and the room quieted like it always did. Even my uncles straightened. Even my aunts stopped mid-sentence. My father thrived in that moment, when every eye turned to him, when he became the authority everyone deferred to. He looked at me and didn't smile. "Come here," he said, not loud, not angry, calm enough to scare me. I walked forward, heat crawling up my neck. 30 faces turned toward me, curious, expectant, some already sympathetic, like they knew how this ended. I stood beside him, feeling small, wishing I could disappear into the carpet. "You want to tell everyone why you think it's acceptable to disrespect this family?" he asked. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't know what answer he wanted, and with him, guessing wrong was worse than saying nothing. He shook his head slowly, like I'd already failed some invisible test. "You clearly don't understand consequences," he continued. "I'm grounding you. No phone, no friends, no leaving the house except for school. A month." A few gasps fluttered around the room. Someone murmured my name softly, but no one intervened. They never did. "And," his voice slicing clean through my chest, "you'll apologize to everyone here for your behavior." That's when something inside me cracked. It wasn't the grounding, it was the performance of it, the way he needed witnesses, the way my shame fed his sense of righteousness. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry. Crying only ever made him colder. "I didn't do anything," I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. His jaw tightened, and I knew I'd crossed the line. "Go to your room," he snapped. "We'll discuss additional consequences later." I turned and walked away, every step heavy, my ears ringing with the sound of blood rushing through my head. Behind me, the party resumed in fragments, voices lowered, tension thick. I closed my bedroom door and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall where a crack ran from the ceiling down like a scar. I felt humiliated, exposed, smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. What no one in that living room knew, not even me fully, was that my father's control had already started slipping. He just didn't realize it yet. An hour passed, maybe 2. The house grew quieter as relatives prepared to leave. I heard coats being pulled from hooks, goodbyes exchanged. I stayed in my room, counting the seconds, bracing for whatever came next. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't the polite chime of a guest leaving something behind. It was firm, official, repeated. I heard my father answer it, his tone shifting, the confident edge dulling just slightly. Another voice followed, calm, professional, unfamiliar. Footsteps moved toward the living room again, and the murmur of conversation rose, confused now, curious. I cracked my door open just enough to listen, my heart pounding, unaware that the truth was finally walking into our house, uninvited and unstoppable. I stayed where I was, half hidden behind the hallway wall, because something told me if I went back into my room, I'd miss whatever was about to happen. My heart was thudding so loud I was sure someone would hear it. The living room lights felt harsher now, like they were exposing things that had been comfortably hidden in shadow just minutes earlier. The man stood near the coffee table, neat suit, leather briefcase resting at his feet. He looked out of place among the half-eaten plates and paper napkins, but he didn't seem uncomfortable. My father, on the other hand, had lost his effortless authority. He gestured for the man to sit, then thought better of it and remained standing himself. "For those of you who don't know me," the man said calmly, "my name is Daniel Ross. I'm a family attorney." That word, attorney, sent a ripple through the room. My aunt leaned forward. My grandmother clasped her hands together. Lawyers didn't just show up unannounced at family dinners. "I represent interests connected to this household," Daniel continued, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick folder, specifically related to guardianship, finances, and the welfare of a minor. My father's eyes flicked almost involuntarily toward the hallway, toward me. I pressed myself further into the shadows. "This is ridiculous," my father said, a tight smile plastered on his face. "Whatever this is, it can wait until business hours." "I've already waited 6 months," Daniel replied. "Tonight is the deadline." The room went completely silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed louder, ticking with deliberate cruelty. "What deadline?" my uncle asked. Daniel looked around the room slowly, as if measuring the weight of the truth before letting it fall. "The deadline to disclose information that has been legally withheld." My father's voice sharpened. "You're out of line." "I'm well within it," Daniel said. He opened his briefcase and removed several documents. "Mr. Hale, you were notified repeatedly. You chose not to respond." I had never seen my father look cornered. Anger, yes. Disgust, yes. But this was different. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "This concerns my daughter," he snapped. Daniel nodded. "Yes, it does." A murmur spread through the room. My name floated on the air in whispers. I felt dizzy, like the floor beneath me was tilting. "6 months ago," Daniel said, "a trust reached maturity." My father laughed again, too loud. "A trust? You must be mistaken." "I'm not," Daniel replied evenly. "The trust was established by your late wife." That landed like a blow. My mother's name hadn't been spoken aloud in that house in years. She died when I was 9, and my father treated her memory like a locked room, off limits, inconvenient, better forgotten. The room shifted. My grandmother inhaled sharply. My aunt's hand flew to her mouth. "She set aside funds," Daniel continued, "specifically for her daughter's education and living expenses, to be transferred into her control upon her 16th birthday. My 16th birthday had been 3 weeks ago. My breath caught painfully in my chest. "That's impossible," my father said, his voice rising. "There was no—" "There was," Daniel interrupted gently, "and you've been acting as trustee." Every head in the room turned toward my father. "Trustee?" my uncle repeated. Daniel nodded. "Which means you were legally obligated to act in the best interest of the beneficiary." I felt cold all over. "You are also required," Daniel added, "to inform her of the trust's existence." The silence was unbearable. My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous red. "This is a private family matter." It became a legal one when funds began to disappear. That word, disappear, made my stomach twist. "What funds?" my grandmother asked weakly. Daniel placed a document on the table. Over the past 2 years, significant withdrawals were made from the trust. None of them were authorized by the beneficiary. I felt like I was falling. Images flashed in my mind: my father's new car, the renovation of the kitchen, the vacations he'd taken alone, claiming he needed space to grieve. "You stole from her?" someone whispered. My father slammed his hand on the table. "I raised her. I paid for everything she has. That money went to this family." "It went to you," Daniel corrected, "and that distinction matters." I didn't remember stepping into the room, but suddenly I was there, standing in plain sight, every eye on me. My father turned, startled, his expression flickering through anger, shock, and something like fear. "Go back to your room," he ordered. "No," Daniel said firmly, "she has the right to be here." My father stared at him, then at me. For the first time that night, he didn't look powerful, he looked exposed. Daniel turned toward me, his voice softening. "You didn't know about the trust, did you?" I shook my head, barely able to speak. "I suspected as much," he said, "which is why I'm here." My father scoffed. "She's a child." "She's the beneficiary," Daniel replied, "and as of 3 weeks ago, the funds should have been transferred to her." My legs felt weak. I sank onto the edge of a chair, my mind racing. Everything I had ever been told about our finances, about why I couldn't join certain activities, why I needed permission for everything, it all twisted into something ugly and clear. "You grounded me," I said suddenly, my voice shaking, "because you didn't want me to know." The words hung there, fragile and sharp. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. Daniel gathered the papers. "At this point," he said, "we can proceed cooperatively or formally." "What does that mean?" my aunt asked. "It means," Daniel replied, "that the truth is out and it's not going back into the dark." I looked around the room at the faces of my family, some horrified, some ashamed, some furious on my behalf. For the first time, I wasn't the problem. I was the proof. And my father knew it. The room didn't explode the way I expected it to. There was no shouting match, no dramatic walkout. Instead, everything slowed, like we were all underwater, moving through thick, suffocating silence. My father stood there, breathing hard, eyes darting from face to face as if searching for someone to rescue him from the truth that had finally caught up. Daniel pulled out another document, smoothing it carefully on the table. "Before anyone says something they can't take back," he said, "I want to be very clear about what this means." His tone wasn't accusatory. It was precise, practiced, almost compassionate. "The trust is legally hers. Any misuse of those funds is a breach of fiduciary duty." My grandmother's voice trembled. "How much?" Daniel hesitated, then answered, "Just over $200,000. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I felt my chest tighten painfully. 200,000. I had grown up believing we were barely getting by. I'd worn hand-me-downs, I'd skipped school trips, I'd listened to my father lecture me about sacrifice. "That money was for her future," my aunt said, tears spilling freely now. My father finally lost his composure. "You think I wanted this?" he shouted. "You think raising a child alone was easy? That money kept a roof over her head." Daniel didn't flinch. "Records show otherwise. The house was paid off years ago. Your expenses increased significantly after your daughter turned 14. I stared at my father, my mind replaying every moment I'd defended him to myself, every time I told friends he was strict because he cared, every time I'd swallowed my resentment because I believed we were struggling together. "You let me believe we were poor," I said quietly. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a split second I thought he might apologize. Instead, his face hardened. "You were fed, clothed, educated, controlled." The word surprised me as it left my mouth, but it felt right. Daniel cleared his throat. "There's more. The room collectively tensed. In addition to the trust, there are provisions regarding guardianship. My father stiffened. That's not relevant. It is now, Daniel said. Your late wife specified that in the event of financial misconduct, secondary guardianship would be reviewed. My grandmother let out a soft cry. She planned this. Daniel nodded. She did. I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest at the mention of my mother, like her hand resting gently on my shoulder from somewhere far away. How much does that mean for my granddaughter? My grandmother asked. It means, Daniel said carefully, that the court may consider a change in guardianship if cooperation isn't established. My father laughed bitterly. You're going to take my daughter away from me? No, Daniel replied. Your actions may. The weight of that settled heavily on the room. My father looked around, desperate now. You're all going to believe him over me? My uncle stood up. We're believing the documents. I'd never seen anyone challenge my father like that. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable. Daniel turned to me again. I want you to know something, he said. You didn't cause this. You didn't deserve the humiliation you experienced tonight. My throat tightened. I nodded, unable to speak. Effective immediately, steps will be taken to protect the remaining assets and to recover misused funds. My father's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You think you can just rewrite my life? Daniel met his gaze calmly. I think your wife already did. That was the moment my father broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. His shoulders sagged and the fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. I stood there, watching the man who ruled my world shrink under the weight of his own choices. I didn't feel triumph. I felt grief for the father I thought I had, for the years I'd spent believing I was unworthy of trust. Relatives began to speak in hushed clusters. My aunt came to sit beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. I'm so sorry, she whispered. For what? For not seeing it sooner. Daniel gathered his things. I'll be in touch with you, he said gently. You're not alone in this. As the night wound down, relatives left quietly, their glances toward my father a mix of pity and judgment. He didn't stop anyone. He didn't say a word. I went to my room later, but sleep didn't come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. What would happen next? Where would I live? Could I ever trust him again? Down the hall, I heard my father pacing, restless, defeated. For the first time, his footsteps didn't sound like authority. They sounded like uncertainty. And somewhere in that long, quiet night, I realized something that changed me forever. I wasn't grounded anymore. I was finally free to see the truth. Morning came in thin gray light that slipped through my curtains like it didn't want to disturb me. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw papers on the table, heard the word trustee echoing in my head, felt the sharp sting of realizing my life had been shaped by lies. For years, I'd measured myself by my father's rules, his punishments, his version of reality. Now that version had cracked wide open, and I didn't know what to do with the truth spilling out. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. No radio humming, no clatter of dishes, no sharp instructions barked from the kitchen. I sat up slowly, listening. The silence felt cautious, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw my father sitting at the dining table, still dressed in the clothes from the night before. His tie lay loosened beside him, his hair uncombed. He looked older somehow, smaller. He didn't look up when I entered the room. "Are you going to school?" he asked flatly. "I don't know," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded once, as if that was the only response he deserved. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching him from a distance. This was the man who had grounded me in front of 30 relatives, who had made me feel like a criminal in my own family. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes. "They're turning you against me," he said suddenly. I stiffened. No one had to. He exhaled sharply. "You don't understand how hard things were after your mother died." "I was there," I said quietly. "I was 9. I watched you shut down." His jaw clenched. "I did what I had to." "So did she," I replied, surprising myself again. "She planned for me." That finally made him look up. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion and something that looked like regret but never quite crossed the line into it. "She didn't trust me," he muttered. "No," I said gently. "She trusted me." The words hung between us, heavy and final. Later that day, my aunt came to get me. My father didn't protest. He didn't argue. He just watched from the doorway as I packed a small bag, his hands shoved deep into his pockets like he didn't know what to do with them anymore. I walked past him without touching, without hugging, without saying goodbye. I didn't know if I was allowed to or if I even wanted to. At my aunt's house, everything felt unfamiliar but safe. She made tea and let me sit in silence. She didn't demand answers. She didn't tell me how to feel. That alone felt like a kindness I hadn't realized I'd been missing my whole life. Over the next few days, Daniel called. He explained things slowly, carefully, like he was afraid sudden movements might scare me off. He told me the court would likely appoint a financial guardian until I turned 18. He told me the remaining funds were being secured. He told me none of this was my fault. Everyone kept saying that, and slowly, painfully, I started to believe them. What surprised me most was my family. Relatives who once watched silently now called to check on me. Some apologized, some cried, some admitted they'd always sensed something was wrong but didn't know how to challenge my father's authority. Their guilt poured out in awkward, messy ways, but it felt real. One evening, my grandmother asked to see me alone. She took my hands in hers, her skin thin and warm. "Your mother was brave," she said, "braver than I ever gave her credit for." I swallowed hard. "I don't remember her very well." She smiled sadly. "She remembered you enough for both of you." Those words stayed with me. Weeks passed. School resumed. Life tried to return to something resembling normal, but I wasn't the same person who'd been humiliated in that living room. I stood straighter. I spoke when something felt wrong. I stopped apologizing for existing. My father tried to call once. I didn't answer. Daniel said that was okay. "You get to choose the pace now," he told me. One afternoon, as I sat on my aunt's porch watching the sun dip low, I realized something else. That grounding, that public shaming, it had been his last attempt to remind everyone, including me, that he was in control. He'd needed to assert it before it vanished. And it had vanished anyway. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. Clear about who I was without his shadow looming over me. Clear about the future my mother had tried to protect. Clear about the kind of adult I didn't want to become. The truth hadn't just walked into our house that night. It had opened a door I didn't know I was allowed to walk through. And once I stepped over that threshold, there was no going back. The first court letter arrived in a plain white envelope with my name printed neatly across the front. My hand shook when I opened it, not because I was afraid, but because it felt official in a way nothing in my life ever had before. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a warning. It was information. That alone felt revolutionary. Daniel sat beside me at my aunt's dining table, walking me through every line. He didn't rush. He didn't talk over me. When I asked a question, he answered it like my understanding mattered. I realized then how rarely adults had ever spoken to me like that. "They'll want to hear from you," he said gently, "not in a confrontational way, just your experience." My experience. I rolled the words around in my mind. For so long, my experience had been dismissed as attitude, disrespect, exaggeration. Now it was evidence. The hearing was set for early spring. Until then, I stayed with my aunt. My father was instructed to have no direct contact with me unless approved. When Daniel explained that, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because the pressure eased instantly. Sadness because part of me still wished he'd fight for me the right way. He didn't. Instead, he sent a message through his attorney. It wasn't an apology, it was a defense. Pages of justification about sacrifice and stress and misunderstood intentions. Reading it felt like being grounded all over again, except this time I saw it for what it was. "I don't have to respond, do I?" I asked Daniel. "No," he said. "Silence is also a statement." So I stayed silent, and in that silence I found space to breathe. At school, people noticed the change in me before I did. A teacher pulled me aside one day and said, "You seem lighter." I smiled, not knowing how to explain that the weight I'd been carrying didn't belong to me. At home, my aunt's home, I learned small, ordinary freedoms, choosing what to eat without being judged, studying without fear of interruption, going to bed without bracing for criticism. These things seemed trivial to outsiders, but to me they felt monumental. The hearing day arrived quietly. No dramatic buildup, no crowd of relatives, just a small room, a judge, Daniel, my aunt, and my father sitting across from me. He looked put together again, controlled, like he was wearing a mask polished for the occasion. When it was my turn to speak, my voice trembled at first. I talked about the grounding, about the way he used humiliation as discipline, about growing up believing we were struggling financially while being told my needs were selfish. I didn't accuse, I described. The judge listened. That alone felt healing. My father spoke next. He framed everything as concern, protection, authority. The words sounded hollow now, stripped of the power they once held. When it was over, the ruling was clear. Temporary guardianship would remain with my aunt. A financial conservator would manage the trust until I turned 18. Investigations into misuse of funds would continue. My father's shoulders slumped. He didn't look at me. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. My aunt hugged me tightly. Daniel smiled, professional but warm. "You did well," he said. I didn't feel brave. I felt honest, and that was enough. That night, I sat alone in my room and thought about my mother. I imagined her at a desk somewhere, signing papers, thinking ahead to moments she wouldn't be there to protect me. I wished I could tell her it mattered, that it worked. Months passed. Life settled into a new rhythm. Therapy became part of it. At first, I hated it. Talking about feelings felt indulgent, dangerous. But slowly, I learned how deep the damage went, how control masquerading as care had shaped my self-worth. My father faded into the background of my life. Updates came through lawyers, through distant relatives. I heard he was angry, then embarrassed, then quiet. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I focused on my own rebuilding. On my 17th birthday, my aunt baked a cake and let me choose everything, from the flavor to the music playing in the background. It was the first birthday that felt like it belonged to me. As I blew out the candles, I made a wish that surprised me. I wished not for money or revenge or even justice. I wished for peace. And for the first time, it didn't feel out of reach. Peace, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It slips in quietly, almost timidly, when you finally stop bracing for the next blow. I didn't notice it right away. It showed up in small moments, waking up without a knot in my stomach, laughing without checking myself, making plans without fear of punishment. Therapy peeled back layers I didn't know existed. I talked about the grounding, but I also talked about the smaller things. The way my father read my journal once and called it dramatic nonsense. The way he'd compare me to other kids, always finding me lacking. The way love always felt conditional, something I had to earn by being quiet, obedient, grateful. My therapist called it emotional control. Naming it didn't erase it, but it gave me language, and language gave me power. At school, I started applying for programs I'd never considered before. Summer courses, scholarships, opportunities I'd been told were unrealistic or unnecessary. When acceptance emails came in, I cried. Not because of the achievements themselves, but because no one had tried to stop me from wanting them. Daniel checked in periodically, always professional, always respectful. He updated us on the legal process without overwhelming me. Some of the misuse funds were recovered, some weren't. What matters, he told me once, is that your future is protected now. My aunt became something like a compass. She didn't tell me who to be. She showed me what steadiness looked like. On hard days, she'd sit beside me without speaking, letting the silence be enough. On good days, she celebrated without jealousy or control. One evening, almost a year after that night, my father asked to meet. He didn't demand, he didn't order, he asked. I stared at the message for a long time. My heart didn't race the way it used to. That alone told me how far I'd come. "You don't have to," my aunt said when I showed her. "I know," I replied. I agreed to meet him in a public place, a cafe near the park, neutral ground. I arrived early, chose a seat near the window. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked thinner, less certain. We sat across from each other, hands wrapped around untouched cups of coffee. "I lost control," he said finally. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "I hurt you." Lost control. I waited. He continued, "I thought discipline would keep you close. I didn't realize it was pushing you away." I nodded slowly. "I told you that." He looked down. I didn't listen. There it was, small, imperfect, but closer to truth than he'd ever come. "I'm not ready to forgive you," I said calmly. He swallowed. "I understand." We sat in silence for a moment. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't terrifying either. "I'm doing better now, and that has to matter." He nodded again, eyes wet. "It does." When we parted, I didn't feel closure. I felt boundaries, and that was enough. As my 18th birthday approached, the trust officially transferred into my name under supervision. Seeing my own signature on legal documents felt surreal. This wasn't just money, it was autonomy. I started planning my future in concrete ways: college campuses, career paths, apartments with light-filled kitchens. Each plan felt like a quiet rebellion against the life I'd been told to accept. On the anniversary of that family dinner, I found myself thinking about the girl I'd been, standing in a living room, humiliated, grounded, stripped of voice. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her something simple and true. This isn't the end. Because it hadn't been. It had been the beginning, the moment the truth walked in and refused to leave. By the time I turned 18, the story everyone thought they knew about my family had quietly rewritten itself. There were no announcements, no dramatic revelations beyond that first night, just a slow, steady shifting of truths settling where lies had once lived. I felt older than my age, but not in the exhausted way I used to. This was a grounded kind of growing up, rooted in choice instead of fear. The trust officially became mine a week after my birthday. I sat at a small conference table with a financial advisor, my aunt beside me, Daniel on speakerphone. They spoke in careful, respectful terms, explaining options instead of issuing commands. College savings, living expenses, long-term planning. Every decision came with the same sentence at the end, but it's up to you. Those words still felt unfamiliar, like a language I was learning late in life. I chose to start small, tuition covered, a modest apartment near campus, a promise to myself not to spend the money proving anything to anyone. The trust wasn't a trophy, it was a tool. My mother had intended it that way. College felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. No one knew me as someone's daughter. No one watched me for mistakes. I made friends who asked what I liked instead of what I was supposed to be. I learned how to disagree without being punished. I learned that my voice didn't have to shake to be valid. My father stayed at a distance, occasional updates filtered through relatives. Therapy, someone mentioned. Selling the house, downsizing his life in ways that felt symbolic, even if unintentional. We spoke rarely. When we did, the conversations were careful, restrained, like two people learning a new set of rules neither had written. One afternoon, during my second semester, my grandmother visited me on campus. We walked slowly across the quad, students laughing around us, life unfolding in all directions. She squeezed my hand. "Your mother would be proud," she said. I smiled, tears stinging my eyes. "I hope so." "She is," my grandmother replied firmly. That night, alone in my apartment, I thought about that dinner again, the humiliation, the grounding, the way my father had stood tall, certain of his authority, convinced that public shame would keep me small. I realized something then that stopped me cold. If Daniel hadn't walked in that night, I might have believed him forever. The truth hadn't just saved my future financially, it had saved my sense of self. I began volunteering with a mentorship program for teens who struggled at home. I didn't tell them my whole story. I didn't need to. Sometimes all it took was listening without judgment, believing them without proof. I saw myself in their guarded expressions, their careful words, and every time I told one of them, "You're not imagining this," it healed something in me too. On the 1-year anniversary of that family gathering, my aunt hosted a small dinner. Just a few people, no speeches, no tension. Laughter flowed easily. I noticed how different it felt when love wasn't conditional, when no one was waiting for a mistake to correct. As the night wound down, my aunt raised her glass gently. "To truth," she said, "even when it's late." I raised mine too. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt something settle deep inside my chest. Closure wasn't about confrontation or revenge. It was about clarity, about knowing where the story really began and where it no longer had power over me. My father had tried to ground me that night, to define me in front of 30 relatives. Instead, he'd unknowingly set the stage for my freedom. The lawyer hadn't just walked in with documents, he'd walked in with proof that I mattered enough to be protected. And that knowledge stayed with me, steady and unshakable, as I stepped fully into the life that had once been hidden from me. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves as endings. They don't arrive with certainty or finality. They come softly, almost ordinary, and only later do you realize they were the closing of a door that once defined everything. My ending came on a quiet afternoon, years after that night, when I found myself cleaning out an old box of papers I'd carried from place to place without ever opening. At the bottom was a copy of the trust document. I hadn't needed to read it in a long time. My life no longer revolved around what it gave me or what it had taken from someone else. Still, I unfolded it slowly, my fingers tracing my mother's signature. I imagined her sitting somewhere calm, thinking ahead, loving me in a way that didn't require control. I realized then that I no longer felt anger when I thought of my father. Not forgiveness either, just understanding, distant and clear. He had wanted obedience because obedience was easier than vulnerability. He had wanted power because power kept his own fears quiet. None of that excused what he did, but it explained why he failed so completely at being the father I needed. We spoke one last time not long after. It wasn't planned as a goodbye, but it became one. He called to tell me he was moving out of state, starting over. His voice was steady, careful. He asked how I was doing. I told him the truth. I was doing well. "I'm glad," he said. And for the first time, I believed he meant it. When we hung up, I didn't cry. I didn't feel hollow. I felt finished. Life continued, as it always does. I graduated. I built a career I loved, one rooted in advocacy and listening. I rented my first place without asking permission. I filled it with light, with plants, with music that played as loud as I wanted. I built friendships that felt like family. I learned what respect looked like when it wasn't tangled up with fear. Sometimes at family gatherings, someone would mention that night in hushed tones, the dinner, the lawyer, the truth. It had become a story others told about me, about resilience, about justice arriving at the last possible second. I always listened politely, but I never corrected them when they missed the point. Because the real story wasn't about money, it wasn't even about exposure or consequence. It was about a girl who learned that humiliation loses its power the moment truth enters the room. It was about realizing that authority without integrity is fragile, no matter how loud it stands. And it was about understanding that being grounded by someone else doesn't mean you can't still rise. I think about that living room sometimes. The smell of food, the sound of laughter cut short, the way my father's voice filled the space as he tried to make me small. I remember how my heart pounded, how I believed that moment would define me forever. I was wrong. What defined me was what came next, the courage to listen when the truth spoke, the willingness to walk away from a version of love that demanded silence, the strength to build something gentler, steadier, my own. If you're listening to this and you've ever been shamed publicly by someone who claimed it was for your own good, I want you to know this. Control thrives in secrecy. It crumbles in the light. You are not weak for wanting clarity. You are not disloyal for choosing yourself. That night, my father tried to ground me in front of 30 relatives. He thought he was ending a problem. Instead, he revealed one. And when the truth walked in with that lawyer, it didn't just change my life, it gave me back my voice. And once you have that, truly have it, no one can ever take it away again.